Hey everybody, it's me, the Sports Trivia Guy, coming at you this wonderful Monday. It is possibly a little lower than the teens today, but that is okay, considering that it is supposed to drop to record low temperatures that it hasn't reached in the last 25 years later this week. So bundle up and get some hot cocoa ready. Um, I'll just try to get right into it here. So today we're going to talk about the first Super Bowl. And if anyone has waited, I apologize. I actually started recording this on Thursday of last week, and I got about halfway through, and I realized I hadn't plugged in my desktop, and it just completely unplugged. And thus the video kind of died halfway through. So apologize, a little late getting into it, but here we are, and Super Bowl one. So Super Bowl one took place in January of 1967. It was regarding the 1966 season. The game was between the Green Bay Packers and the Kansas City Chiefs. The Packers represented the NFL, and the Chiefs represented the AFL. Now, what was the AFL? The AFL was, getting in the early 1960s, a league that actually competed very successfully with the NFL. They had teams including the Chiefs, the Patriots, the Broncos, the Jets, and a few others, all of whom later, the Raiders were one of them, all of whom then years later would join up with the NFL. Titans were another, so you can look it up, but several teams came into the NFL. So it was a very successful competition. It wasn't the first time that there was competition with the NFL. The All-American Football Conference in the beginning in the mid-40s all the way to the late 40s existed for a while. It fielded teams including the 49ers and the Browns. They joined up with the NFL, but they're more forgotten about. But there had been some competition in its history, though. The NFL's fiercest competition was the AFL. So AFL and NFL had some conflict. It was basically an unwritten rule that the AFL wouldn't sign any of the NFL players and vice versa until 1965, when Pete Gogolak, who was a kicker for the Buffalo Bills of the AFL, was lured to play kicker for the New York Giants of the NFL, and that created a real sort of that just intensified the battle, you could say. From that, the AFL kind of said, well, anything you can do, we can do better, and went and picked up some key NFL talent. Guys, including some guys who had played on really good teams and maybe were getting old and had been cut. A guy named Johnny Sample, who was a defensive back originally for the Baltimore Colts, and then later in the AFL for the New York Jets. He comes up big in Super Bowl III. Was one of those players, and there were a handful of others. So Lamar Hunt, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs, it was one of the most powerful owners of the AFL. His family, the Hunt family, still owns the Chiefs today. He was one of several individuals working alongside AFL and the NFL teams, including Commissioner Pete Rozelle, who was the NFL commissioner at the time. And his son had this little ball, probably seen it, it's about this big, and you typically throw it against the wall and it just bounces all over the place. It's kind of unpredictable. It's a little rubber ball, and it's called the Super Ball. And they were trying to come up with a name for the game. And Lamar Hunt said, well, we have the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. We have the Rose Bowl that takes place every year. The game's taking place in the Rose Bowl Stadium, Memorial Coliseum in LA. Why don't we call it the Super Bowl? And he kind of said in such a way, he was like, why don't we call it the Super Bowl? But, Pete, I'm sure you could pick a better name, but just throwing it out there. Pete Rozelle went with the name Super Bowl. And it stuck. So indeed, if there was a better name, nobody knows what it was because we've stuck with Super Bowl throughout the years. Last bit of history. It's been rumored for years. The first 4 Super Bowls were played between the AFL and the NFL until they merged. It's been rumored that the NFL won the first two and the AFL won the last two. Therefore, they just decided after the fourth one, okay, we'll merge. We're even. That isn't true. They were actually looking to merge the two leagues by the end of the fourth Super Bowl season, as early as this first Super Bowl year. So, 1966, Kansas City Chiefs. Chiefs are very, very good. They defensively have a Hall of Famer at every position: defensive back, linebacker, defensive line, and their kicker, a guy named Jan Stenerud, is the first special teams player, the first kicker elected into the Hall of Fame later on, and remains the first kicker and only kicker in the Hall of Fame for kicker or punter for 20 years or so. On offense, their quarterback, Glenn Dawson, is a future Hall of Famer. They are able to rack up more points than any other team in the AFL. They are second in yards. They're just all over the place on both sides. Defensively, obviously, with all their talent, they're outstanding, and offensively, they're very high scoring. They win their division. They go to the AFL Championship game against Buffalo, who was the two-time defending American Football League champions. To put that into perspective, if the Super Bowl had started 1 or even 2 years earlier, the Buffalo Bills would have been in the first Super Bowl. They're in Buffalo, and they win 31-7. They soundly beat the two-time defending AFL champions, highlighted by a run by Mike Garrett, who later became athletic director at the University of Southern California, also known as UC, where he actually takes the ball, runs right, meets a wall of defenders, turns around, runs backward probably 10 yards, and makes a circle and basically scores at the left pylon, which was pretty amazing for its day. Green Bay Packers, 1966. Packers, going back to the late 50s, in 1958, the Packers only won one game. So, 1958, they won one game. They're the joke of the NFL. They hire Vince Lombardi. And as football and Packer historians will say, the rest is history. Just 2 years later, Lombardi takes them to the NFL championship game. They lose, but 1961, the next year, they win the NFL championship mightily, 37-0. 1962, they win it again. 63 and 64, they're not in the championship game. 65, they win, and now we're in 66. So, Packers do very well, obviously, in the regular season. They get to their playoff game in Dallas, the one playoff game to decide who goes to the Super Bowl. They're up 34-20 with 5 minutes left. You have to understand, at that point in time, running game was the predominant force in offense as opposed to passing, which is more of an element today. And they certainly didn't practice 2-minute offense where you're designed to go down the field in 2 minutes. So scoring 2 touchdowns in 5 minutes is difficult today. It was considered much more unlikely then. The Cowboys score in like a 60-yard play. Packers have to punt. Cowboys get the ball back. They're down a touchdown. They get first and goal at the 2-yard line, and the Packers make a goal line stand and snuff it out. And Packers win in Dallas and are now going to the Super Bowl. As you would imagine, there was pressure under both leagues to win, to represent their league. There's pressure under both teams to win, to represent their league. Green Bay probably felt it more because the NFL, by most people, sports writers and others, was considered the resounding favorite to win that game. Players would later say that their first half, the Packers players would later say that they felt their first half performance was weakened a little bit by how uptight they were. Vince Lombardi was reported to be very, very nervous before that game because to him, the weight of the NFL is on his shoulders. If the Packers lose, he's going to hear it and he's going to feel it. That's what he's thinking. So the game begins, and they play the first half, and it's only 14-10 at halftime. The Packers are winning, and the Chiefs have actually outgained them in yards. The people are going, "Wow, Chiefs team is for real. They're really good," and they were really good. They were not to be taken lightly. Packers score first on a touchdown pass to Max McGee. This is a funny story. Max McGee was a party boy. He did things then, it being the mid-1960s, that he probably couldn't get away with as much today with the advent of cell phones and other technology. He'd just be photographed and probably brought to the main office and said, "Hey Max, you can't do this. People are taking photos." I don't want to assume what he was doing or accuse him or anything like that, but he was known as a party boy to the point that he, along with Paul Hornung, who was one of the Packers running backs, and this is according to Bart Starr, their Hall of Fame QB, they were fined so many times for being out past curfew that the fines they paid for the Packers team party at the end of every season. So just those two guys and what they were fined were able to pay for parties for the players and their wives at the end of the year. So that's telling you something. Max McGee goes out the night before the Super Bowl, and he's under the impression that he's not going to play because he's the backup wide receiver. So he does what any young person who feels like he's got nothing to lose does. The one time they're really out in a new area and ready to celebrate, he goes out and has a night on the town. And to the point where he comes in stumbling early in the morning because Jerry Kramer, the Packers offensive guard, leaves the hotel to go pick up the newspaper or something. And this is in the early morning, and he sees Max McGee coming in, and he realizes, oh, Max has had a night on the town. Max McGee has a hangover, and on game day, he is actually saying during warm-ups to somebody, he's saying, "I hope they don't make me play today. I don't feel very well." Well, of course he doesn't feel very well, because he has a hangover. So, Boyd Dowler, their starting wide receiver, he gets hurt early in the game. He separates his shoulder, and he's out. And McGee has to come in. And wouldn't you know it, on kind of a broken play, he ends up scoring the first touchdown. So, trivia fact, the first touchdown in Super Bowl history was scored by a guy with a hangover. How's that for history? Packers score first. Chiefs come right back and tie the game. Packers score again. Chiefs kick a field goal towards the end of the first half, and it's 14-10. And a lot of people, a lot of sports writers are thinking, this is really interesting. This wasn't supposed to happen. Should be known that there was some tension, you may say, maybe not that day, but during the season, with the man who scored the second touchdown of the day that day for the Packers, Jim Taylor. Jim Taylor, running back for the Packers, was a Louisiana native. The next year, as was known by many in the NFL, a new NFL expansion team was to be created, a team we now know as the New Orleans Saints. Taylor wanted to and was ready to go to New Orleans at the end of that season. Made sense. He'd already won 3 NFL championships with the Packers. Assuming the Packers would win this game, he was going to win a 4th. He was clearly Hall of Fame material. Didn't matter to Vince Lombardi, though. Vince Lombardi was very upset about that. I'm sure he felt somewhat betrayed, and maybe he felt that the way Taylor didn't handle it during the season was professional. I don't know. I wasn't there, obviously. But it created some tension. It created some strife. So, that was going on kind of in the background. Come out of halftime, and having already mentioned that Vince Lombardi was very nervous at the half, I'm sure in the Packers locker room it was something like, hey, we need to loosen up, we need to play our game, we need to not let the moment get to us, so to speak, because we're good enough to beat these guys, we just haven't played well. I would assume that's kind of the mentality the Packers have, and yet they're probably motivated somewhat underneath by this feeling of, oh my gosh, what if we actually lose this game? We got to go out there and win this thing. So early on in the second half, Chiefs have the ball. Len Dawson, Hall of Fame quarterback, drops back to pass, is hit. The ball is deflected on the throw and lands right in the lap of Willie Wood, the Packers Hall of Fame defensive back, who takes it about 50 yards all the way back to the 5-yard line. Packers end up scoring on a run by a guy named Elijah Pitts, who later becomes a coach for the Buffalo Bills. Packers later score again, this time, if memory serves me correctly, on another Max McGee touchdown pass. So from I don't want to play to I just scored 2 touchdowns. That was the story of Max McGee's day. If you count the early morning hours, there was a lot more to the story than that. So they're up 28-10, and they close it out with another touchdown run by Pitts and make it 35-10. So Packers win, and the celebration is on. Dozens of Hall of Famers playing in that game. Most recently to be inducted was Jerry Kramer, who, when the NFL Network did a top 10 list of players not to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, he showed up as number 1. Kramer became very well known for a book he wrote, The Insider's Tale, about what it was like to basically be with the Packers for an entire season. The name is escaping me right now, but I encourage you to go take a look at it, especially if you're interested in sort of a day-by-day life of a football player in the NFL during the regular season. Granted, this is 50 years later, things have changed, and I believe it was actually the next year that he wrote the book, so it doesn't pertain to the 66 season, but highly recommend it. It's very good reading. Vince Lombardi, of course, becomes a legend, as we all know. Hank Stram, who was the Chiefs head coach, later goes on to win a Super Bowl. He did a lot for NFL Films, which has now produced basically every bit of audio and video recording you see regularly in the NFL, by wearing a wire 3 years later during the during Super Bowl IV. So Super Bowl I, again, Packers win 35-10. The next year they will go back to the Super Bowl and they will play the Raiders. The Super Bowl that my grandfather was actually at. That I still have. My dad still has the pennant in our basement, showing it. And from there, the rest is history. So anyway, that's a little bit of the tale of the first Super Bowl. Send me questions if you have them. I'm sure that there will be plenty more left to tell that I left out, and I do apologize if you research something and say, hey, how come you didn't talk about that? Oops. But hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you learned something educational as always. And have a wonderful day, guys. Stay warm. Talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.